Hi, boys and girls. We're going to continue on with The Wild Robot. I am reading chapter 61 through 64. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. Chapter 61, The Robot Stories. The story of how Roz helped Rockmouth spread through the rivers and across the islands, as it soon followed by other robot stories. There were stories of Roz growing gardens in dry, barren places. There were stories of Roz nursing sick animals back to health. And there were stories of Roz creating ropes and wheels and tools for helping her friends. But most of the new stories were about the robot's wildness. You see, Roz had noticed that the wilder she acted, the more the animals liked her. And so she barked with the foxes and sang with the birds and hissed with the snakes. She romped with the weasels, she sunbathed with the lizards, she leapt with the deer, and that spring was a very wild time for our robot. Chapter 62, The Return. It was a quiet afternoon on the pond, but the quiet was gradually being overtaken by sounds not heard around there for many months. The sounds grew louder and louder, and then a flock of geese appeared in the trees, above the trees. Honk, honk, honk. Most flocks of geese move lazily through the skies and trail off in the wobbly lines, but not this one. This flock was fast. It flew in the perfect V formation, and it was led by a small, graceful goose. The flock flew once around the pond before gliding down and gently splashing into the water. The geese gathered in a tight group in the middle of the pond. They floated there for a while, softly honking to one another. And then the leader broke away from the others, and he swam straight towards the nest, waddled into the garden, and fluttered up to his mother's shoulders. "Welcome home, son," said Roz. "It's good to be back, Ma," said Bright Bill. Chapter 63, The Journey. After months of separation, Roz and Bright Bill, mother and son, were together again. They had so much catching up to do. They went into the nest, and the robot built a fire. The goose gazed into the flames and told the story of his winter. And this is what he said. "We spent the whole first day of our migration flying over the ocean. It seemed like the ocean would go on forever. But just when the flock was getting tired, Longneck pointed to some tiny island on the horizon, and we flew down to one of the islands and ate dune grass and rested our wings. And after a few days of hopping from island to island, we reached the mainland and continued over fields and forests. And then the snow began to fall. I'd never seen snow before, and at first I thought it was beautiful, but it kept coming." And the others explained that the snow was early, and they were never supposed to see it. But there it was, piling up all around us, and we tried to sleep at night. Longneck worried that the weakest geese wouldn't survive, and he was right. We lost old Wildfoot to that very first snowstorm. And we tried to fly around the snowy weather, but we got completely lost, and the weather became even worse. Lakes and ponds and rivers were freezing over. We couldn't find food or water, so we ate snow, and it only made us colder. And we had trouble cleaning ourselves, and our feathers became dirty and heavy, and the flock was in bad shape. But Longneck kept us moving. "We are geese," he squawked, "and geese keep going." And then one day, we were struggling through a snow shower when we saw something called a farm, and it was perfectly square fields and enormous buildings, and stomping her way through the farm was a robot, and she looked just like you, Ma. Longneck sent me over to speak to the robot, but I couldn't understand anything she said, so I just followed her through the farm and around the corner, and then I saw something I never expected. Plants. Bright and colorful plants. I didn't understand how plants could live in such cold weather. But then I saw that they were actually inside a building. I learned later that the building was called a greenhouse and had clear glass walls made of something called glass. And the robot pressed a button on the wall, and the door slid open and the warm air came rushing out. and I hadn't felt warmth in so long that I just had to follow her inside. Ma, it was like summer in there. The air was warm and sweet and sticky, and there were rows and rows of different plants. The robot didn't pay any attention to me, so I wandered around the greenhouse, nibbling on leaves and drinking from puddles. And then I heard a scratchy voice behind me. If I were younger, I would have killed you by now. I spun around, and there was an old cat. And she walked on stiff legs, and her fur was gray and clumpy. And the cat's name was Snooks. And she didn't seem very nice. But then she saw the other geese out in the cold, and their faces pressed against the glass, and she told me how to open the door. You can rest here, said Snooks as she hurried her in, but you have to stay out of sight. The humans aren't as friendly as me. None of us knew what humans were, but we didn't care. We were just happy to be out of the cold. Loudwing was so happy she cried. The flock drank and ate and bathed and slept and stayed out of the way. Snooks showed us where to leave our droppings so it wouldn't be noticed. And for a few days, the greenhouse was our home. Once or twice a day, the robot would go outside and return with a box or bag, but most of the time they stayed inside and quietly worked on the plants. There was a barn that I just had to explore. It was filled with animals and machines and piles of straw and 2 robots. One robot was fixing a broken door when I walked in. She was using a loud spinning tool called a saw, and she pushed the saw through the long piece of wood, and dust shot into the air. But everything was going smoothly until the saw suddenly lurched forward and sliced right through 3 of the robot's fingers. But she was fine. A minute later, there was a thwomp sound as she popped out a new hand, and then she went right back to work using the saw again. The other robots worked with the animals, the chickens, sheep, pigs, cows. They were all in cages, and the chickens kept asking me how I'd gotten out of my cage, and I was explaining that I'd never had a cage when I heard a panicked squawk coming from the greenhouse. I ran back and found that a human had discovered the flock. We didn't know what he was saying, but he looked really angry, and Longneck tried to defend us. He got in front of the spread of his wings and honked, but the human wasn't afraid. He pulled out a shiny stick and pointed it right at Longneck. Snooks hissed, "Look out, he's got a rifle." Suddenly, a bright beam of light shot out of the rifle, and Longneck slumped to the floor. He was dead, Ma. The flock was so scared, we fluttered around and honked and knocked over plants, but the human kept moving towards us, pointing his rifle. So I pecked the button to open the door, and we ran outside into the cold and flew away from there as fast as we could. And without Longneck, the flock needed a new leader, and everyone wanted me to lead. I didn't know what to do, so I just started repeating Longneck's word. I squawked, "We are geese, and geese keep going." And then I took the point, and the flock spread out behind me. The weather had us all turned around, and nobody knew which way to go, so I just led us straight south. We saw more robots and humans and buildings, but we didn't stop. We knew we were way off course, and when we saw the ocean again, but at least it was a little warmer by the water, so I decided to follow the coastline for a while. There were more buildings by the coast. Most of them were on land, but some were in the ocean. The ocean buildings were dirty and crumbly and leading into a different direction. There weren't any humans or robots in the buildings, only sea creatures. We saw ships on the water. We saw ships on the land. We saw ships in the air, and they buzzed through the sky like giant dragonflies. And when we reached a place called a city, where thousands of buildings and robots and human ships were all close together, when we stopped to rest on a rooftop, we met a friendly pigeon named Graybeak. And she had grown up there, so she knew everything about the city. She flew up towers and under bridges and kept us away from all the buzzing airships. And everywhere we went, there were robots. Some of the city robots were just like you, Ma, but others crawled on 6 legs and rolled up on wheels and slid up and down sides of the building. Some robots were really small and some were really big. And they moved things and cleaned things. And they built things and did every kind of job you could think of. Graybeak brought us down to a ledge on the side of the building and told us to look through the windows. And inside, there was a family of humans, and they had a Roz robot. And when we looked into the buildings, we saw other humans with other robots. And every human seemed to have a robot. I told Graybeak about you, Ma, and she wanted to show us one last place. We flew out to the edge of the city to a really big building called a factory. Graybeak brought us to the roof window, and we looked down into the factory and saw machines building sparkling heads and torsos and limbs. The factory was building robots. A machine held a robot torso and put 2 legs under it and then snapped it into place. It put feet under the legs and snapped it into place. It snapped arms into the shoulders and snapped hands into the arms. A head was snapped on top, and the robot was finished. Ma, the robot looked just like you. I think the factory is where you were built. I wanted to watch more robots being built, but it started snowing again, and so we said goodbye to Graybeak and continued flying south. We saw fewer robots and humans and buildings and ships. The air became warmer and the snow disappeared. We started seeing other flocks of geese in the sky, so we followed them to the middle of the wide grassy field where there was a lake and hundreds of other geese. And we had finally reached the wintering grounds. And after all we'd been through together, our flock had become very close. We kept to ourselves, eating and resting and remembering the geese we'd lost. But after a few weeks, we began to mingle with the other flocks, and we met geese from all over the world, and they told us about their homes and their migrations and their troubles with the winter weather. Every flock had lost geese on the way. A few flocks didn't make it at all. Before we knew it, it was early spring. Flowers were poking up, and it was time to fly home. We followed the usual migration route north. We flew over fields and forests and hills, and we didn't see any signs of humans or robots. And that was fine with us. Eventually, we reached the ocean, and then our island, and then our pond, and then I saw you. Chapter 64, The Special Robot. After Brightbill told the story of his winter, he and his mother sat in silence and thought. They thought about poor Longneck and the humans who had killed him. They thought about the farms and the cities and the factories. They thought about Roz and where she truly belonged. Then after a while, Roz told Brightbill of her own winter stories. She spoke of her long, bright, dark hibernation, of how she had awoken to find the nests caved in around her. She spoke of the blizzards and the frozen animals. She spoke of the many lodges she had built and one that caught fire. But she mostly spoke of all the new friendships she had forged. I used to think that you were the only animal who would ever care about me, she said to her son. I worried that without you around, I would be alone again. But I was not alone. In fact, I made new friends, all of my own. I think the other animals might actually like me. Of course they like you, Ma, squawked the goose. You're the most likable robot I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot. It was true. Brightbill had seen hundreds of different robots that winter, and none of them were seeing anything like Roz. None of them had learned how to speak with animals, or had saved an island from a cold, or had adopted a gosling. And as he sat there watching the robot's animals' gestures and listening to her animal sounds, Brightbill realized just how special his mother really was. All right, thank you. We'll see you later.